Hi, I'm Rowan Miller. Let's take a look at an application that uses Entity Framework Code First to access data in an existing database. I'm going to use Visual Studio 2012 for this demo, but you can also use Visual Studio 2010. Before we start writing code, let's take a look at the existing database. Because I'm using Visual Studio 2012, I have LocalDB installed by default, and I've created a database there called blogging. If I expand the database, you'll see the familiar blog and posts model where a blog has many posts and a post has a foreign key that points back to the blog it belongs to. So let's go ahead and write an application that accesses this database. I'm going to create a console application and call it Code First Existing Database Sample. Now at this point we could just start handwriting a Code First model to map to the existing database. But I'm going to use some functionality from the Entity Framework Power Tools to reverse engineer a Code First model for us. The Entity Framework Power Tools are available on visualstudiogallery.com, and I've already installed them. To use this part of the Power Tools, I right-click on my project, select Entity Framework, and then reverse engineer Code First. When I do this, I'm prompted for a connection to the database that I want to reverse engineer from. I'm selecting my LocalDB instance and then the blogging database that we just saw. When I hit OK, the Power Tools are going to go and look at the shape of that database and then calculate what the Code First model to map to it should look like. The Power Tools will keep you updated on the reverse engineer process in the status bar in Visual Studio. Now that the reverse engineer process is completed, let's go ahead and look at the things it added to our project. If we open up the app.config file, we'll see that the Power Tools have added a connection string to the blogging database on our LocalDB instance. Note that the name of this connection string is blogging context, and we'll see why this matters a little bit later. The Power Tools have also generated a derived context for us. This context represents a session with the database and is going to allow us to query and save data. The context derives from dbContext, which is a base type from the Entity Framework. The context also includes a series of DB set properties for each type in our model. This tells the context which types to include in our model, and we'll see later that we can use these properties to query and save instances. If we look at the constructor, you'll notice that it's passing name equals blogging context to the base constructor of dbContext. This is important because it tells Entity Framework that the connection information for this context should be loaded from the app.config file. We saw that earlier when the connection string was named blogging context. The Power Tools have also added a blog and a post class to our project. Let's look inside the blog one as an example. In here you'll see this is a simple class that has no dependencies on the Entity Framework. These are often called POCO classes, which stands for Plain Old CLR Object. These classes contain two types of properties. Simple scalar properties such as blog ID, name and URL, and then navigation properties that make up the relationships between these classes, such as the posts property shown here. You'll notice that the navigation properties are marked with the virtual keyword. This enables the lazy loading feature in Entity Framework. Lazy loading simply means that when I try to access a property, Entity Framework will automatically go and query and populate the contents of this property in the background. Finally, the Power Tools have also generated a configuration class for each type in the model. Let's look inside the blog one. A configuration class is simply a class that derives from entity type configuration and then uses the Fluent API to configure the type. Configuration class just provides a nice way of encapsulating and isolating all of the configuration for a particular entity. Code First also allows you to use the Fluent API directly inside your context. And if you don't want to use the Fluent API, it also provides data annotations as a simpler way of configuring your entities. Currently, the Entity Framework Power Tools will only generate code that uses configuration classes though. Looking at the code that's generated in this class, we can see that it's configuring the primary key, some attributes of the properties, and then it's also defining the table that this class maps to, and the column that each of the properties map to. A lot of this mapping is redundant because Entity Framework Code First would actually work it out by default. For example, the primary key is called blog ID, and Entity Framework could automatically calculate that this is the primary key. At the moment, the EF Power Tools will always generate this complete mapping. There is work planned in the future to allow only generating the mapping that is explicitly required. If we go back to our derived context, we can see that these configuration classes are registered in the onModelCreating method. Now that we've created a model, let's go ahead and use it to perform data access. I'm going to start by newing up an instance of the blogging context. Note that we always wrap a context in a using statement to ensure that any resources used by the context are freed up once we've finished with it. With that done, let's prompt the user for a name for a new blog. We're then going to create an instance of a blog and add it to the blogs property on our context. Remember that the blogs property is a DB set of blog. Once we've added it, let's call save changes. Save changes will write any pending changes in the context out to the database. In this example, that's the single insert for the new blog instance. Let's also write a link query that queries for all blogs ordered by the name. We can then for each over the results of that query and write the name of each blog out to the console. Now that we've written our application, let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. As expected, we're prompted for the name of the blog. I'm going to use ADO.NET blog as the name. All blogs in the database are then written out to the screen ordered by name. In this video, we covered how to create a code-first model based on an existing database, and then how to use that model to perform data access.